What do you know about demigods? The creatures who have one god parent and one mortal parent. In our own world, we have myths that tell us about the great adventures of gods and men, and sometimes, when the stars align, a demigod might come out who can change the world. We've seen that time and time again with figures like Hercules, Achilles, and Theseus, to name a few. But what about in Middle-earth? Were there any demigods in Tolkien's universe? To put it simply, there were. Not only that, a demigod was actually the great-great-grandmother of Aragorn, King of Gondor. I'll tell you all about that particular demigod in a minute, but before we dive into this, what exactly do you know about the gods of Middle-earth in general? In Tolkien's world, there were two distinct sets of earthbound gods. There were the Valar and the Maiar. The Valar are what you would imagine when you think of Norse or Olympic gods of our Earth. The Valar have the most natural power at their command, and they could move entire mountains, carve out trenches to make seas, and even fill the sky with stars. Now, the Maiar were similar to the Valar, but they just didn't possess the same raw natural abilities, so they spent most of their time assisting the greater Valar. And in the early years of the world, which Tolkien termed Arda, the gods lived in Middle-earth, but after Melkor, the most evil member of their order, destroyed it, the Valar and Maiar retreated to a distant continent called Aman. There they raised giant mountains on the shores to protect themselves from Melkor, and they established a kingdom for just the good gods called Valinor. It was from this group of gods that Aragorn's ancestor belonged, and her name was Melian. She was a goddess of nature. During the building of the world, she helped the greater Valar goddess Yavanna cultivate forests, trees, flowers, and all the things that grew. At some point after Melkor destroyed the lamps of the world, and the gods went to their new kingdom of Valinor, Melian would often spend her days under the great trees there. Sometimes she would pass her days resting or singing, and when she sang it was so captivating that the other Valar and Maiar gods all stopped what they were doing to listen to her, and it was actually this very skill she would pass to her children. Eventually Melian decided to return to Middle-earth, despite the threat of Melkor and his Balrogs that roamed the continent freely. Remember, Melian was a Maiar. She was powerful, but being from that lesser group of gods meant that she wouldn't be able to defend herself if one of the Dark Lord's more powerful creatures attacked her, but she went to Middle-earth anyway. It was in that same age that the elves were born into Middle-earth. This means that the entire race of elves sprouted up from some hidden place and walked into creation. All of the Maiar and Valar gods had actually been anxiously awaiting this moment. They had been tasked by their creator, Eru Ilúvatar, to make the world a habitable place for his children, who would later be known as elves and men, and every god and goddess held these beings dear to their heart. One day, while wandering the forests of Middle-earth and tending to the flowers and trees, Melian ended up meeting a male elf. His name was Elwë. They quickly fell in love and after time gave birth to a baby girl. This girl's name was Luthien, and Luthien is special for a few reasons. For one, she's the only demigod in Middle-earth, since she has a god for a mother and an elf for a father. Second, she's the only person to convince Mondos, the god of the dead, and Eru Ilúvatar, the god creator of the entire universe, to resurrect a man. And with that same man who she managed to resurrect, she would do something that no one had ever done. She would have half-elf, half-human children, which would create one of the biggest dilemmas in Middle-earth. Since elves and men's souls go to different places when they died, half-elven had to choose during life whether they would be elf or man. If they chose elf, they would become immortal and be allowed to live the rest of their lives on Arda. If they chose to become mortal, then they would die like every other man, and their souls would go to a place beyond the physical realm that only Eru Ilúvatar knew about. Now, at the beginning of this story, I promised to tell you how all this was connected to Aragorn. Well, actually, Luthien's children are the same exact ones who would later birth the kings of Númenor, and eventually Aragorn. I could list for you all the names here, but to make it simple, the goddess Melian gave birth to Luthien, and a few generations later, Luthien's grandchildren gave birth to Elros and Elrond, and yes, that is the same Elrond who would later become the Lord of Rivendell. Elrond and Elros were actually half-elven themselves, since both of their parents were as well. Unlike Elrond, Elros would choose to become immortal, and it was through this line, several thousand years later, that we would eventually wind up with a young Dunedain ranger named Aragorn on the throne of Gondor. Now, we know that the half-elven of Middle-earth possessed unique skills that they inherited from their mortal parents. In many ways, they were easy to distinguish from men. Elves were made of hardier stuff, meant to possess an immortal body, but even half-elves were stronger than normal mortals. So, did Luthien's heritage, the fact that her mother was a god of Valinor, give her any special gifts? We're not really sure here, to be honest, because she was said to be the most beautiful woman in all of Middle Earth, which might be connected to her divine heritage, and she also managed to appeal to Mondos and Eru, where so many others had failed, but that too probably just had to do with her uniquely sad story instead of any special abilities. Some would argue that no, a Maiar's power wouldn't pass to their child, but maybe they just didn't read a lot of the Silmarillion, because if you just read a few pages of Luthien's journey to retrieve a Cimmeral from Morgoth's crown, then we can see just how powerful of a demigod she was. And her particular power was enchantments. Like her mother, whose singing would put the great Valar of Valinor at ease, Luthien's singing was equally enchanting. She used this skill to shake the fortress of her enemies, and along with her hound companion, Huon, she managed to defeat Sauron on her way to Melkor's lair. When she eventually found her way to Melkor, the first Dark Lord, she used her powerful enchanting songs to put him and all of his underlings into a deep, deep sleep. After they fell asleep, she stole Cimmeral from Melkor's crown. Her power was so great that she did the very thing that so many other elves and Valar and Maiar couldn't. She technically defeated Melkor the Great Dark Lord. She also could use her singing to make things grow, which makes sense, because her mother was a goddess of nature who used to sing in order to cultivate plants and trees. Luthien was also a skilled healer, and one has to wonder if Aragorn received this gift from her too.